Hi guys, I'm here today to do a where to start with poetry. Now I've done a lot of videos on poetry already, all of which I will link down below. I'm a poet myself, I read a lot of poetry, I've got a poetry collection out. So a lot of you have been asking me if I will do recommendations of places that you think you should look for your first poetry collection or where to start because you find it slightly overwhelming, which I completely understand. I would encourage you to not feel overwhelmed or intimidated by poetry. I've made a video about that already and lots of other poetry videos as well, which I will link in the description if you want to go and check those out. But today I'm going to be talking about starting points where you can look to find poets that you might enjoy reading, as well as a few specific recommendations from me. My first recommendation for poetry would be literary journals. So check out poetry journals because they publish a wide variety of poets, and at the back of each issue will be a biography and as to whether or not they have some collections published. So if you find a poem that you really like, you might think, oh, I'd like to go and read their full collection. You can go check the biography and then go find out more. Some of my favourite poetry journals here in the UK are the Rialto and Poetry London. There are a lot of online journals as well where you wouldn't have to pay a subscription fee, though I do prefer reading in a magazine form, but that's entirely up to you, obviously. I will link some of the poetry journals that I particularly like, both online and in subscription paper format, in the description box down below. Another good place to look would be somewhere in a poetry anthology, such as the Foreword Prize collection, which is published every year. Now, the Foreword Prize is the main poetry prize in the UK for new work. So there are 3 Foreword Prizes, the first being for the best single poem published in a literary journal during the year, the second for the best debut collection published this year, and then the third for the best collection overall. And extracts and poems from each of the highly commended and shortlisted and winning poets are in here. So this is a new one which has just come out. Another really good anthology to check out would be the Best British Poetry, which is published by Salt. This is the 2012 edition. I believe that the 2015 one has just come out. And what is quite fun about this one is that it has the poems and they go through, and they're in alphabetical order, I believe. And then at the back, the poets have written a short piece on what inspired the poems and where those poems have come from. It's maybe quite good if you're not familiar with poetry and you'd like to understand how poems are written and where ideas come from and how those get created into something. So yes, I would recommend these. All of the things that I'm talking about are going to be linked in the description, don't worry. If you're new to poetry and you're not sure where to start, a good way of trying to get into it is to look and see if any of the authors that you already love in novel form and short story form also write poetry, because whilst their poetry is not going to be the same as their novels, they're probably going to write about similar themes or have a slightly similar writing style, and it might be nice to have a favourite author of yours hold your hand and guide you through your first poetry reading experience. So for instance, Margaret Atwood writes a lot of poetry, and John Burnside writes a lot of poetry, and Catherine M. Valente also writes a lot of poetry, as does Mark Haddon, as do a lot of authors such as Michael Ondaatje, who maybe you wouldn't think did and haven't looked into before. So if you've got a favourite author, I would have a look and see if they have written any, because that might be a good place to start. Poetry pamphlets are a really great way to see whether or not you enjoy a poet's work, because they're normally about 20 poems, so not a full collection. And the way that the publishing industry works, especially in the UK and the States, is that poets will have a pamphlet out before their first full-length collection. They're normally called pamphlets in the UK and chapbooks in the States, and there are lots of beautiful presses that do these kind of things. In the UK, you've got places such as Tall Lighthouse and Happenstance, and there are loads in the States, more in the States than there are here. So I'm going to link some of my favourite ones down below. If on a website the poet's work isn't sampled alongside the collection, which is something that sometimes isn't done and bugs me a lot, because I like to read a couple of poems before I buy a collection, and often I can't buy small poetry presses in bookshops because they're not stocked, so I have to buy them direct from the publishers online. If you find a collection that doesn't have a sample poem next to it, just Google the poet's name along with the word poem, and hopefully it'll bring up some literary journals online with samples of their work, so you can have a look and see if they write the kind of thing that you're interested in. One of my favourite pamphlets published in the UK is Liz Berry's collection called The Patron Saint of Schoolgirls, which is published by Tall Lighthouse. I would also recommend Liz's full-length poetry collection, which has come out since this and actually won the Foreword Prize for Best Collection last year, which is amazing. Liz is a wonderful person, and I fell in love with her poetry before I realised that she used to come into the bookshop that I worked in quite a lot, so we ended up chatting and having coffee and she's the sweetest person. So I would especially recommend her pamphlet if you are new to poetry, because her full-length collection plays more with accent and is perhaps more obscure than this, but they're both equally beautiful. If you think you might prefer giving spoken word type poetry a listen, then I would recommend googling people like Kate Tempest and Holly Manish, both of which will be linked down below. And two spoken word poets whose collections I would particularly recommend are Sarah Kay with her collection No Matter the Wreckage, which is this beautiful collection. I'm reading it at the moment. I first became aware of her after her TED Talk when she did a long poem called, I think, A to B, and lessons she wanted to tell her daughter. And this is just stuff that she's learnt in her life. I'll read you the first one, which is called Love Poem number 137. I will wake you up early, even though I know you like to stay through the credits. I will leave pennies in your pockets, postage stamps of superheroes in between the pages of your books, sugar packets on your kitchen counter. I will Hansel and Gretel you home. I talk through movies, even ones I've never seen before. I will love you with too many commas, but never any asterisks. There will be more sweat than you are used to, more skin, more words than are necessary. My hair in the shower drain, my smell on your sweaters, bobby pins all over the windowsills. I make the best sandwiches you've ever tasted. You'll be in charge of napkins. I can't do a pull-up, but I'm great at excuses. I count broken umbrellas after every thunderstorm, and I fall asleep repeating the words, thank you. I will wake you up early with my heavy heartbeat. You will say, can't we just sleep in? And I will say, no, trust me, you don't want to miss a thing. So there's that one, which is particularly beautiful. And then this, which I don't think is can you pick up that up on the camera? It's got like a circus in the background, and it's called What We Buried, Poems by Caitlin Scheel. And what I love about this is at the back, it has Caitlin's small biography, and it says that Caitlin is 20. At 20 years old, she is still growing. She has found her voice, and it is a delicate thing. So she is happy to be sharing it, which is how I felt when I was reading this collection. It's very powerful, there's a lot of great feminist poems in here, and just the way that she talks about things in a very frank manner, I really loved. So I'll read you one quickly, which is called The First Word I Teach My Daughter. The first word I will teach my daughter will be no. She will sing it to me and scream it at me, and I will never tell her to quiet down. She will say it when I tell her to go to bed, when I tell her she can't have any more candy or watch any more television. No will be my daughter's favourite word. Not only will I teach her how to say it, but I will teach her to repeat it over and over again until every single atom in her tiny little body hums with it. If it makes her less soft than the other girls, I will take her to museums and show her what marble and stone can become. I will brush her hair and let her wear whatever she wants. If this makes her a warrior in a field of flowers, then she will walk without fear of being trampled on. The first word I teach my daughter will be no. And when she grows up in a world that tells her that she can't walk down the street by herself, that no will be heard. It will roar and echo down the block, and she will never be told to keep silent. She will not know the meaning of the word. Also, if you're new to poetry and you're not sure where to start, but you have a big interest in a particular subject matter, then maybe you should go and try and track down poetry about that. So if you're into art, maybe you'll like Pascal Petit's collection, What the Water Gave Me, which is poems inspired by Frida Kahlo. If you like science, perhaps you should go and check the collection called Poems from the Mullard Space Science Laboratory by Simon Barraclough, which is where he went on like a writer's residency with some scientists in a lab, and they created poems together. He doesn't know much about science, they didn't know much about poetry, but they came together and created this book, which is one I will be reading shortly. If you like space, then maybe you should read Tracy K. Smith's Life on Mars, science fiction poetry. If you like fairy tales, then I would recommend something like Janet McAdams' Feral, which is a wonderful collection inspired by fairy tales. If you would like to break out and have some real fun with different forms of poetry, all of these poems that I've recommended so far are in free verse, because that's the kind of poetry that I like to read. But if you want to read something more than just free verse, then perhaps pick up something such as Some Planet by John Montaro, which has poems in all kinds of forms, lists, and even flow charts. Like a poem as a flow chart. It's an absolutely wonderful idea. It's mad and it's wonderful. And finally, a good way to get into poetry is maybe to link it with a book that you have read before and loved. So for instance, if you are a fan of Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, then I would recommend Glass and God by Anne Carson, which Anne Carson is not someone that I would particularly recommend as a first poet, but if you love Wuthering Heights, it gives you that extra context when reading her, and it starts off with a character who feels as though she is Kathy from Wuthering Heights, and it's just this wonderful long poem where she's staying with her mother in the Yorkshire Moors, and it's really great. A book that I've read recently and raved about, if you've seen it in a wrap-up video, is Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. I absolutely loved this book, and it is inspired by Ted Hughes Crowe. This is about grief. It's about a father who's a Ted Hughes scholar whose wife has died, and he is trying to come to terms with that, and he has 2 children, and they're both trying to cope. And one day this character called Crow comes into their lives, who's a representation of grief and lots of other different things. And as I said, that is inspired by Ted Hughes' collection Crow, which is about a godlike figure called Crow who causes destruction. So if you wanted to read this one first and then maybe pick up this, I think reading this first would really help you get into this poetry collection and hopefully get into poetry in general. And finally, if you are into Emily Dickinson's poetry, or even if you're not, then I would highly recommend picking up Fair Copy by Rebecca Hazleton. It says on the back, on her 29th birthday, Rebecca Hazleton decided to take the first line of every 29th poem of Emily Dickinson and use it as an acrostic to write her own poems. So this is what Fair Copy is. It's absolutely beautiful. It's very fairy tale inspired. It's just absolutely gorgeous. Now also, this is probably not one I would recommend as your first ever poetry collection, but I would encourage you to pick it up and lose yourself in the words, even if you don't understand what she's talking about some of the time, because, you know, that is the beauty of poetry, that if you kind of just focus on the things that you do understand and the feel of a poem and how it affects you, you'll get a greater sense of what the poem is trying to do than if you try and analyze every single word. So my overall thing is, poetry is great. Please don't be intimidated by it. There's a lot of stuff out there that you can find, a lot of great stuff, a lot of small poetry presses, so many different genres. There's something out there for you if you would like to go and try and find it. I will link all of these books in the description box down below, as well as a list of poetry journals that you might like to check out and poetry presses which you might like to browse. I'll also leave links to my other poetry videos and links to my own poetry, as well as my poetry collection, The Hungry Ghost Festival. I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions about poetry or any specific questions about what I've said in this video, please leave them in the comments down below and I'll answer them there. I hope you guys are having a really great week, and I'll speak to you soon. Lots of bookish love. Bye.